In the summer of 1944, as the battles across Normandy raged through hedgerows, villages, and forests, a quiet piece of American technology slipped into the war almost unnoticed. It did not roar like a tank, did not thunder like artillery, did not dive from the sky like a fighter-bomber. Yet, it would reshape the battlefield more profoundly than many weapons that seemed far more fearsome. It was the SCR-536 Handie-Talkie, a radio so small, so simple, and so rugged that German soldiers who first saw it refused to believe it was real. It looked like something from a different age, a device that should not have existed in a war defined by steel, oil, and heavy machinery. The scrubby green box, with its short antenna, weighed less than 3 pounds, stood barely a foot tall, and could be held in one hand. A soldier could operate it while firing his rifle, crawling through mud, or sprinting across an open field. It needed no backpack, no separate power unit, no delicate assembly. It was a single, self-contained tool designed for the rough hands of infantrymen who lived and died in chaos. It was a revolution wearing the disguise of a toy. Before the SCR-536 arrived on the battlefield, radio technology belonged to commanders, tank crews, artillery observers, or specialized signal units. The idea that an ordinary infantry rifleman could carry his own radio was almost unthinkable, especially to the German army. The Wehrmacht relied heavily on wired field telephones, runners, flashing signals, and large AM radios that were heavy, fragile, and notoriously unreliable in damp European weather. German infantry radios were so rare that many platoons went to battle without a single one, relying instead on voice whistles and messengers crouched low, running under fire to deliver instructions. German doctrine accepted this weakness as a fact of war and built tactics around the assumption that small units would fight isolated, blind, and dependent on local initiative. Then the Americans arrived with a different idea. They believed every infantry squad deserved instant communication. Every soldier deserved a voice that carried farther than his lungs could shout. The SCR-536 became the instrument of that philosophy. It was an American answer to the problem of war, simple, rugged, and mass-producible. The device used AM like German radios, but with far superior filtering circuitry, moisture-resistant casing, and a straightforward push-to-talk design that even a terrified 19-year-old could operate under fire. Its range of 1 mile in broken terrain was modest, but enough to link squads, leaders, and support elements together in ways the Germans did not imagine. The first time American infantry deployed the SCR-536 in combat, it performed not like a novelty, but like a force multiplier. A squad leader pinned down behind a hedgerow could call another squad to flank a machine gun position. A platoon sergeant could instantly reorganize his men when German armor appeared. A company commander could coordinate movements across a village without leaving cover. These were small things, individually, but together they created a new kind of battlefield rhythm, a new speed of war, and the German army had no idea why their traditional advantages suddenly felt weaker. But the shock truly began when a German patrol captured its first Handie-Talkie near the village of St. Lo. The scene was recorded in a post-battle report by a communications engineer who had been summoned from division headquarters to examine the strange American device. The patrol had found it in a ditch next to the body of a radio man. The German soldiers at first laughed. They assumed it was some kind of civilian contraption, useless for war, perhaps something taken from a merchant ship or handmade by a soldier desperate for a gadget. They handed it to their superiors with amused skepticism. But when the signal engineer arrived and opened the casing, his amusement evaporated. Inside the small housing, he found a compact arrangement of vacuum tubes, transformers, filters, and contacts arranged with a simplicity that belied its durability. The battery was sealed against moisture, the antenna extended smoothly, and the circuitry showed a level of miniaturization German engineers had struggled to achieve even for radios 3 times as large. He tested the device, switching it on and hearing a faint but unmistakable stream of English voices coming through clear and sharp despite the humid Normandy air. He ran further checks and found the receiver remarkably immune to interference. German notebooks recovered after the war captured the astonishment in plain, cold handwriting. They have built a radio for every soldier, while we build radios only for officers. The engineer took the Handie-Talkie back to headquarters, where a group of signal specialists and officers gathered around it, staring at something that felt like an artifact from a future they were not prepared for. One officer asked how many such radios the Americans had. The engineer replied, "All of them." The silence that followed was heavy. The German army prided itself on engineering precision, yet they had focused their talent on tanks, artillery, optics, code machines, and specialized communications equipment, not on radios small, cheap, and rugged enough to place in every man's hands. Their industrial philosophy favored complexity and high-performance items, while the American approach embraced simplicity, mass production, and reliability over perfection. The Handie-Talkie was the purest expression of that philosophy. It did not impress with range, it did not impress with power, but it impressed with what mattered most on a battlefield: the ability to endure mud, rain, shock, and panic and still transmit a clear message at the exact moment a life depended on it. As the German engineers continued their examination, they discovered the most important truth of all. The SCR-536 was not an isolated marvel. It was one device inside an entire American ecosystem of battlefield communication. The Americans had the SCR-300 for long-range squad-to-platoon coordination, the SCR-536 for short-range squad-to-squad connectivity, and vehicle-mounted radios linking armor and infantry together. The Germans had none of this, and now staring at the little radio in their hands, they understood why their enemy had seemed to move with uncanny speed, why American squads converged and diverged with impossible coordination, why artillery arrived exactly when needed, why armor supported infantry with near telepathic precision. The Handie-Talkie was not just a tool, it was the missing link in the German understanding of how the Americans fought. It was the smallest piece of a vast, invisible machine, and that invisible machine was what the German army had never prepared to fight. An army connected at every level, an army where a private could speak to a sergeant and instantly change the outcome of an engagement, an army that turned every soldier into a node of information. And in a war where speed of coordination mattered as much as power fire, that was a revolution the Germans never saw coming. And it began with a box small enough to fit in the hand of a single American soldier. The first time the Germans truly understood the significance of the SCR-536 came not in a laboratory or at a command post, but in a ruined farmhouse outside Saint-Lô, a place where smoke drifted through shattered beams and the smell of cordite clung to every inch of the air. German infantry from a reconnaissance detachment moved cautiously through the wreckage, searching for maps, documents, ammunition, anything the Americans might have left behind. They expected rifles, helmets, field rations, spent casings, the usual debris of battle. What they did not expect was the small green object lying half-buried under broken plaster, the size of a canteen case, but shaped like nothing they recognized. One soldier picked it up, turned it in his hands, and laughed. At first, it felt too light, too unimportant to merit a second thought. Then he flipped the small metal switch on the side and froze. A burst of static hissed out. A line of English words cracked through, followed by another. The soldiers around him fell silent. The corporal who found it looked at the others and muttered something. "The Americans carry radios this small?" The squad leader snatched it from him, examined it, confused, unsettled, and shouted for an officer. The officer arrived irritated until he placed the device to his ear and listened. His face transformed from annoyance to disbelief. That night, the Handie-Talkie was rushed back behind the lines to the Divisional Signals Detachment, where it was handed to the ranking communications engineer, a thin, bespectacled major who had spent most of the war designing antenna arrays for panzer battalions. He took the device into his workshop, set it under a lamp, and began taking notes. Within 10 minutes, the notes had changed tone. The man who wrote them expected to ridicule American engineering. Instead, he became silent, focused, leaning closer with each new line of inspection. The Handie-Talkie was opened by carefully removing its screws. The interior revealed an arrangement of circuitry unlike any German portable radio the engineer had ever seen. Simple, robust, moisture-resistant.
The tubes were small, ruggedized, the wiring clean, the filtering stages better than those in many of their larger field sets. He checked the seals, he checked the antenna mount, he checked the tuning knob. Every part had been designed with infantry use in mind, not for ideal lab conditions, but for mud, blood, rain, and panic. He pressed the transmit switch, spoke into the microphone, and heard his own voice return through a test harness, smooth, steady, clear, despite the storm outside. He wrote in his notebook the first sentence that would later be quoted repeatedly. "They have built a device that should not work this well in this weather." Then he added the line that spread quietly through the signals community of the Wehrmacht. "They have mastered radio miniaturization, while we still struggle with bulk and fragility." As more engineers arrived, they passed the radio between them. Their conversations grew sharper, more anxious. German portable radios at that time were large boxes with external batteries, long whip antennas, and cases that swelled with moisture in the damp Normandy air. They required skilled operators, careful tuning, and constant maintenance. If dropped, they often failed. If the weather turned wet, they became unreliable. If fired upon, the shock could damage internal components. But here was an American device the size of a loaf of bread that had survived a firefight, rain, a house collapsing on top of it, and still functioned perfectly. The engineers noticed another detail, something subtle but shocking. The battery compartment was sealed and lined with insulating material to reduce moisture penetration, something German radios rarely had. The engineers argued at first, insisting such a seal would surely limit power output, but the device proved them wrong during a bench test. Its range held steady, a mile or more, even in the cluttered terrain the Americans were using. Thousands of these. The realization hit them like a blow. The Germans had assumed the Americans were coordinating their movements in Normandy through a full network of field telephones, or by placing radios only at higher command levels. Instead, they discovered that coordination came from below, from the smallest units, squad leaders talking to squad leaders, fire teams linking up, platoons adjusting on the fly. Each small group of Americans was not just acting bravely, they were acting with information. The Germans understood now why the Americans reacted instantly to ambushes, why their flanking maneuvers were so fluid, why artillery landed with uncanny timing, why attacks synchronized across hedgerows, even when no officer seemed to be directing them. They had been hearing each other every moment, while German squads sat isolated, trapped inside the bocage, with no way to coordinate except by shouting, hand signals, or sending runners who often died before delivering a message. The gap was not in courage or training, it was in time. American squads lived in seconds, German squads lived in minutes. In war, that difference was fatal. The more the engineers studied the Handie-Talkie, the more alarming the implications became. The amplitude modulation design was nothing new, but the Americans had solved the problem of interference through clever filtering and consistent crystal control, something German field radios often struggled with, especially under damp battlefield conditions. They noticed the casing had been molded to resist shock, something that allowed the radio to survive impacts and rough handling. They noticed the simplicity of use, a single switch, a single push-to-talk button, no complicated frequency dials, no tuning wheels, no setups. Everything had been reduced to the essentials, so that even a scared soldier under fire could operate it without thought. Finally, they realized the most devastating truth of all. This device was cheap enough, rugged enough, and simple enough to mass-produce in staggering quantities. While Germany labored to build a handful of specialized radios, the Americans were issuing thousands of these Handie-Talkies to infantry units across Normandy. The engineers produced a written summary that reached the divisional intelligence section the next morning. It contained the line that spread like a spark through German command. "They have transformed radio from an officer tool to a soldier's tool." And with that sentence, the German army understood what they were really facing. Not just American firepower, not just American numbers, but an American army connected at the lowest levels, acting with unity, speed, and coordination that no German formation could match. In the days that followed, German officers surveyed the wreckage of battles and finally saw the pattern. Every American breakthrough, every flank, every sudden concentration of forces, every perfectly timed artillery strike had begun with the same thing. A voice spoken into a small green radio. The Handie-Talkie had exposed a weakness the Germans never knew they had. Communication at the bottom of the chain was too slow, too brittle, too limited. Now, for the first time, they realized why the Americans seemed to be everywhere at once, moving like water, shaping the battlefield faster than German units could interpret it. The Americans were fighting a new kind of war, and the Germans had only just discovered the small device that made it possible.
The bocage of Normandy was supposed to be the perfect equalizer for the German army, a terrain so tight, so suffocating, that American firepower, armor, and air superiority would be blunted by dirt walls older than nations themselves. Each hedgerow was a fortress, each field a trap, each sunken lane a ready-made kill zone. German infantry and machine gunners believed they could hold off any American advance simply by forcing the fight into these cramped patches of earth where initiative, courage, and local leadership mattered more than grand strategy. They were right about the terrain, but they were wrong about the Americans. Because the Americans had something the Germans did not expect, something small enough to fit in a pocket, yet powerful enough to bend the entire battlefield to their will. The SCR-536 Handie-Talkie did not look like a weapon, but it behaved like one. Every time a firefight erupted behind a hedgerow, every time smoke filled a crossroads, every time a German machine gun opened fire from a barn window, the little radio awakened and rewrote the flow of battle in the space of a heartbeat. In one after-action report from the U.S. Army, a lieutenant described the moment his squad stumbled into a German ambush. "We were pinned in the ditch, machine gun above us, mortars landing behind us. I told my radio man one word, right flank." He transmitted it, and in less than 10 seconds, the entire platoon was moving. It was as if the rest of the company had been watching the same moment. The lieutenant did not know it, but he had just described the very thing that shocked German commanders. American fire and movement were no longer two separate actions. They were one seamless reaction, joined by a voice over the airwaves. For German squads, the discovery was terrifying. They attacked an American position, thinking it was isolated, only to find within seconds a new squad reinforcing the line. They moved to flank a machine gun nest, only to have mortar fire drop precisely in the path of their movement. They opened fire on a small group of Americans, thinking it was routine, only to watch a Sherman tank burst through a hedgerow in direct response. The speed was unnatural, impossible, yet it happened again and again. A German corporal interviewed after his capture outside Saint-Lô explained it plainly. "We thought we were fighting one squad, and then suddenly we were fighting three. Then artillery hit, and then a tank arrived. It made no sense. It was as if they shouted and the battlefield answered." The Germans were partly right when they said it. It was not magic. It was the SCR-536. Once a squad leader pressed the transmit button, the information spread instantly through the platoon network. Leaders shifted their formations, moved fire teams, signaled mortars, and coordinated with armor, all faster than the Germans could reload a rifle. German tactical doctrine excelled at initiative, but depended on physical messengers, on line-of-sight communication, on the rhythm of junior leaders making decisions in isolation. American doctrine in Normandy, with the Handie-Talkie in every squad, created something entirely different, a distributed intelligence system. Each soldier became a sensor, each squad a node, each platoon a living, reacting organism. The battlefield was no longer a set of disconnected skirmishes, it had become a web of linked actions. The SCR-536 thickened that web with each passing hour. Americans learned how to exploit this new connectivity with terrifying efficiency. When a German machine gun opened fire behind a hedgerow, a single American rifleman might spot a gap, relay it to his squad leader, and within seconds, a flanking element moved into position while the main squad pinned the gunners down. When German armor appeared unexpectedly, Americans no longer panicked. They called for bazooka teams, mortar support, or a Sherman tank that was often within range but unaware of the threat until the radio whispered its arrival. Even simple tasks, once slow and risky, became precise and almost elegant. A squad searching a farmhouse could call another squad to cover the exits.
A patrol approaching a crossroads could request immediate overwatch from a nearby team unseen behind a wall. A company preparing to assault a village could sweep information across the radio net, checking left flank, right flank, timing, and fire support, all in less than a minute. The Germans never understood how Americans turned confusion into clarity so quickly. They assumed officers must be everywhere, directing each movement. But many American attacks were shaped not by captains or majors, but by sergeants, corporals, even privates carrying the little radio at their side. The German assumption that American infantry was clumsy, slow, and overly dependent on massed fire was shattered by the reality of SCR-536-enabled combat. American squads were acting with precision and coordination that surpassed even elite German infantry units because information traveled faster than instinct. One moment captured in a German journal tells the story perfectly. The writer describes seeing American soldiers suddenly shift direction, move across a field, and converge on a farmhouse so quickly it looked choreographed. He wrote, "They moved as only men move who all share the same understanding of the battle. We could not believe they were receiving orders so quickly." Another entry from a German signals officer was even more blunt. "Our infantry fights in fragments, theirs fights as a single organism." The German inability to communicate quickly handicapped them at every turn. A German squad pinned down often had no means to reach their platoon leader except by sending a runner through gunfire. By the time orders arrived, the situation had changed. A German platoon preparing a counterattack often had no way to tell neighboring units or coordinate with machine guns already firing. By the time artillery support was requested, the Americans had already shifted position or flanked around the fire zone. But for American squads, the Handie-Talkie erased these delays. A squad could request support instantly. The platoon leader could redirect units instantly. The company commander could alter the axis of advance instantly. And all of this happened while German units were still waiting for a messenger to deliver a note in pencil. American fire and movement fused into a single act. Fire no longer froze units, it guided them. Movement was no longer a gamble. It was coordinated through voice, timing, and rapid response. The SCR-536 allowed the U.S. Army to use its natural advantages, numbers, flexibility, initiative, but with unprecedented speed. German soldiers experienced this as something supernatural, an enemy who never stayed shocked, who never remained isolated, who always responded as if reading their intentions. The truth was more sobering. The Americans were not reading German minds, they were simply talking to each other, and the Germans could not. German units relied on courage, training, and discipline. American units relied on all those things too, but also on a discreet green radio that turned every soldier into both participant and communicator. The Handie-Talkie was not glamorous, it was not even powerful, but in the hands of American infantry, it became the thread that bound men into a single unified fighting force, fast, fluid, and relentless. And in the bocage, where seconds determined life and death, nothing was more dangerous than speed. The Germans would learn this lesson more painfully with each passing day, as they slowly realized that the Americans did not defeat them with overwhelming firepower, they defeated them with overwhelming connectivity. And it all began with a small radio that fit in a pocket and changed the movement of war itself.
When the first captured SCR-536 reached a proper German signals laboratory far behind the front, the officers expected an oddity, something curious but insignificant, a gadget perhaps clever but surely inferior to German craftsmanship. The Wehrmacht, after all, prided itself on engineering excellence, on precision machining, on devices assembled with the care of watchmakers and the pride of artisans. They expected to hold the American radio up as proof that their own doctrine was still correct. But what they found instead was a quiet indictment of their entire communications philosophy. The room was a converted schoolhouse, lined with tables covered in coils, vacuum tubes, batteries, and half-assembled radios. 3 engineers waited for the courier. The courier arrived carrying the Handie-Talkie in a burlap sack, as if ashamed of it, ashamed perhaps to give officers a toy they would laugh at. The senior engineer, an older man with narrow spectacles, lifted it and stared at it as though he were holding a lie. This small? No external battery? This light? He turned it over slowly, his brow furrowed, and then he spoke quietly. "Fetch the screwdrivers." When they removed the casing, the room fell silent. Inside the radio, they found not crude shortcuts or sloppy workmanship, but elegance. The circuitry was simple but deliberate.
each component sturdy and positioned with efficient spacing. The filtering stage was robust, the tuning crystal well protected, the wiring clean and insulated, the battery pack sealed against moisture and shock. The senior engineer whispered a sentence that another officer later wrote in his diary. His voice carried disbelief. "They have produced what we have failed to design for years." His assistants ran basic checks, switching the device on, sliding the antenna up and down, keying the transmit button. The radio worked instantly, as though it had never left the factory. The range test inside the schoolyard confirmed a stable signal across breaks in terrain and even through thick stone walls. One junior technician stared at the tiny vacuum tubes inside the set and muttered, "They are half the size of ours and twice as resilient." It was not simply the parts that impressed them. It was the philosophy behind it. German portable radios were designed by electrical engineers who imagined ideal operating conditions, shielded command posts, or armored compartments. They were not designed for infantry, mud, rain, and fear. American engineers had designed with the opposite assumption. The device needed to work after being dropped, after being submerged, after being thrown into a ditch, after somebody stepped on it, after a firefight, after mud filled its seams, and after the operator froze with terror. American engineering assumed chaos. German engineering assumed control. This difference now stared the engineers in the face as they examined the Handie-Talkie. It was not refined, but it was effective. It was not delicate, but strong. It was not perfect, but reliable. What it sacrificed in sophistication, it gained in battlefield reality. The engineers took turns studying the midget components, each one realizing with growing unease that the Americans had mastered miniature mass production, something German industry could not match. The Wehrmacht excelled at high-quality, low-quantity equipment. Tanks, radios, optics, guns built with pride, but built slowly, built expensively, built for specialists. The Americans, by contrast, built for the masses, thousands upon thousands of identical units, each rugged, cheap, easy to maintain, and simple to use. And the SCR-536 embodied that truth perfectly. The more the German engineers studied the device, the more their frustrations sharpened. They privately admitted that to build something like this at scale, Germany would need factories untouched by bombing, access to steady supplies of copper, brass, and vacuum tubes, and a fundamental change in doctrine. None of those things existed anymore. The war had already eaten them in. The Wehrmacht depended on wire telephones that were useless the moment an artillery shell cut the line. They depended on runners who died before delivering messages. They depended on bulky AM radios that failed in damp weather or lost their tuning after a single shock. But here in their hands was a device that a single American private could operate with one thumb, equipment that allowed entire squads to communicate instantly, equipment that gave American infantry a speed of coordination that German officers still could not comprehend. This small radio explained everything. Why the Americans seemed to shift faster, why their flanking maneuvers seemed perfectly timed, why artillery struck with uncanny precision, why small units behaved like one coordinated machine. It explained what German troops had reported with disbelief. They are connected. The German engineers wrote their formal report in cold, terse sentences, but the emotion behind it was unmistakable. One line stood out above all others. They have turned radio into something every soldier can carry. We have failed to do this. The report reached higher headquarters, where officers read it with discomfort. Some dismissed it, a novelty, hardly decisive. Others understood more clearly that this discovery was a warning, a sign that the war was changing beneath their feet. Radios were no longer tools of officers. Radios were no longer luxury equipment. Radios were now the nervous system of an army united across squads, platoons, companies. Radios were turning the Americans into something more fluid than anything the Wehrmacht had expected. An army able to coordinate at the lowest levels. An army able to respond in seconds, not minutes. An army able to act with a unity the Germans had once believed only they possessed in panzer divisions and elite formations. But now that unity belonged to American infantrymen, carrying green boxes the size of their forearm. The German engineers kept studying the Handie-Talkie for days after, running brutal tests, dropping it from windows, hitting it with rifle stocks, soaking it in water, burying it in mud, and still the radio worked. Maybe with less clarity, maybe with reduced range, but it worked. One engineer watching the last test finally sighed and wrote a final line in the margin of his notebook, a line that captured the despair of every German technician who touched the device. The Americans did not beat us with radios. They beat us with philosophy. They built for the soldier. We built for the officer. And the officer cannot be everywhere. The soldier can. And with that realization, the engineers understood what their frontline troops had already learned in blood. Every American fighting in Normandy carried not just a rifle or helmet, but a connection, a voice, a link to a far faster, smarter, more cohesive force. The SCR-536 was not simply a radio. It was the proof that Germany was fighting the wrong war with the wrong tools and the wrong assumptions. And the weight of that truth would follow them all the way back to the ruins of the Reich.
By the autumn of 1944, as the battles pushed from the bocage into the open plains of France, the true legacy of the SCR-536 finally revealed itself. Not through a single dramatic moment, but through 1,000 small ones. In every town, every field, every forest across Europe, the Americans moved with a unity that stunned enemies and surprised even themselves. It was the birth of a new age of warfare, an age where the battlefield was no longer shaped only by fire and steel, but by information, carried across airwaves by the quiet, unwavering voice of a soldier holding a small green radio. The Handie-Talkie had begun as a tool to help squads coordinate, but by late 1944, it had become something much larger, something no doctrine had predicted. It connected the thoughts of scattered men across torn landscapes. It stitched together movements that would otherwise have been blind and chaotic. It gave junior leaders the power once reserved only for officers, and it brought the vast machine of American firepower down to the level of a single infantryman in the mud. Before the SCR-536, war had always been limited by the slowness of communication. A platoon could not move without knowing what the next platoon was doing. A company could not advance without being sure the flanks were secure. Artillery could not fire without clear signals. Armor could not support infantry without precise timing. Even elite armies were trapped inside the delays created by distance, noise, fear, and confusion. The SCR-536 broke those delays. It gave the Americans something that seemed supernatural to the Germans, the ability to coordinate in real time. In a war where seconds mattered more than strength, more than bravery, more than numbers, time itself became a weapon, and the Americans had captured it. German officers, during interrogations after the war, admitted the same painful truth again and again. The Americans fought with the speed of thought. Our men fought with the speed of orders. That difference shaped every battle from Normandy to the Bulge. In the forests of the Hurtgen, when visibility dropped to a few meters, Americans used the Handie-Talkie to guide each other through tangled undergrowth. When a German ambush erupted, the squad leader transmitted a short burst of words. Squads shifted flanks, mortars registered fire, and the ambush collapsed within moments. When fog rolled through the woods, reducing even the closest units to silhouettes, the radio formed invisible threads between them, allowing them to maneuver without losing cohesion. German units in the same woods relied on runners, who often never returned. American units relied on voices carried instantly through static. German soldiers felt the difference long before their officers wrote about it. They attacked a small American position, expecting to overwhelm it, only to find the Americans reinforcing within seconds. They prepared a counterattack, only to discover American units shifting away before the first order could even be delivered. They hid from tanks behind a ridge, only to find infantry swinging wide to encircle them because someone on the radio had whispered the tank's position. The pace was relentless, unforgiving, alien to an army that had relied for decades on precision but also on predictable rhythms. The SCR-536 shattered those rhythms forever. One German captain captured near Metz summarized it perfectly. Our battle plans held for minutes, their battle plans held for seconds. By winter 1944,
Even German engineers and staff officers understood that the Americans had done something revolutionary. They had democratized communication. The SCR-536 had taken a capability once locked inside command vehicles and radio trucks and placed it literally into the hands of common soldiers. The effect was not simply tactical, but cultural. American officers were suddenly willing to give far more initiative to junior leaders because those leaders could coordinate rather than act blindly. American squads became proactive, aggressive, and fluid because they knew support was always seconds away. A tank could be called, not with a flare or a runner, but with a single transmission. An artillery strike could be brought down not with a map and compass, but with a shouted grid. A platoon could change its direction without seeing each other because the air carried their intentions in real time. These changes shaped the way the Americans fought for the rest of the war. At the Siege of Brest, at the crossing of the Moselle, at the breakout toward the Rhine, the SCR-536 let American infantry adapt faster than German defenses, reorganize faster than German reserves, and recover faster from surprise than German commanders could comprehend. The device itself was humble: green metal, black knobs, small tubes, and a battery pack. But its influence rippled outward like a shockwave through the entire Allied command structure. After the war, American generals wrote that the SCR-536 had done for tactical warfare what the telephone had done for cities. It reduced distance to zero. Distance between squads, distance between thoughts, distance between decisions and actions. It allowed an army to behave like a single organism even when spread across miles of terrain. And in doing so, it forged the concept that would define the next century of warfare: networked forces, decentralized command, distributed intelligence. No longer would war belong only to generals drawing arrows on maps. It would belong to the soldier in the hedgerow with a radio who could see the battlefield change in real time and speak the words that changed it further. German engineers who examined the Handie-Talkie recognized too late that they had witnessed a turning point. They wrote bitterly that the Americans had created a new category of weapon: not a rifle, not a bomb, not a tank, but a device that transformed the way armies thought and moved. One engineer closed his final report with a line that echoed like a verdict: "They have won the war of communication, and we never even entered it." Today, historians call the SCR-536 the grandfather of modern soldier radios, but its true legacy is deeper. It didn't just link soldiers, it linked actions, linked decisions, linked entire battles into something coherent. It made speed the decisive factor in a way no army had ever achieved before. From Normandy to the Rhine, the Americans fought like a connected organism, living, thinking, adapting faster than any opponent. The SCR-536 was the pulse of that organism. Each transmission a heartbeat, each voice a spark of intelligence, moving through a vast nervous system built on discipline, courage, and a piece of technology small enough to hold in one hand. In the end, the Handie-Talkie did not win battles alone, but it ensured that every American who carried one was never truly alone. And, in the brutal chaos of World War II, that single fact changed everything.